Muma Rope has perhaps the most pointed and striking start to any game I've played. After an obligatory content warning, the player will see the protagonist in a featureless room in front of a chair and noose. At the end of the tutorial listing off simple controls less than half a minute into the game, the player is immediately free to interact with the chair. After doing so and watching the simple animation, the player is booted back to the menu as if they finished the game and achieved an ending. I've seen critics describe this game as edgy, and dismissive connotations aside, it's difficult to deny. The opening is dark, bold, and provocative, but perhaps more than that, it's blunt. The game is conveying its subject matter immediately, in the most straightforward way possible. Muma Rope is about a girl who wants to end her own life. Even the title of the game conveys only the name of the protagonist and her method of choice, clarifying it as the central idea. And what's even more striking is the breadth of tone the game portrays if you continue on. The first memory item you obtain is chewed bubblegum, sitting in view of the chair that ends the game. Muma's bouncy walk cycle has her sway wildly, a charmingly goofy animation that will play as you walk down the path painted with arrows indicating the direction of her demise. The first level you walk into from the start is a beautiful grassy hub with a bunch of bunnies. I need not say more to establish the contrast. The titular rope is an element that really paints over the experience of playing the game. The audience will inevitably consider all of these elements in the context of the horror that it started out with. Of course, it's not the only framing the player will have. Muma Rope is a Yume Nikki fan game, collaboratively developed by members of the French RPG maker community over the course of 11 years. It's not a very popular fan game, despite featuring an Yume Nikki online project. In fact, this video might be the first English review on the website, so it's unlikely that anyone will encounter this first without having played and completed Yume Nikki itself. The conventions established in Yume Nikki then will frame how the player thinks about Muma Rope. For example, Yume Nikki had Madotsuki get in bed to access most of the levels, which contextualize the surreal world of the game as all being a dream. Despite Muma Rope lacking any upfront conventional symbols to indicate as much, the base assumption will be that everything we see is a product of her psyche. I think this is essential for a full appreciation of the game, as it asks the player to reconcile the death drive of the protagonist with the fact that our first look into her mind is such an idyllic image of life and beauty. Though perhaps the more obvious frame would be how the ending of Yume Nikki matters for the beginning of Muma Rope. The most straightforward interpretation from seeing Madotsuki jump from their balcony would be that maybe the whole time Madotsuki wanted to die. That's not the only interpretation, but it's intuitive, common, and I would argue evocative for the light in which it paints the imagery seen in the rest of the game. This ending is so iconic that many fan games either carry the spirit of the grim and shocking tone, or at the very least exist in contrast to it. Part of what makes Muma Rope interesting even among its peers, then, is that this is how it starts. Rather than the death of the main character being some late surprise or eventual expectation, it is the immediate central element. As you go about the typical fare of Yume Nikki and its derivatives, exploring the dream world for various items, events, and secrets, you'll return to the starting room quite frequently to get your bearings. And every time, the chair and noose will remain as they are. It feels very clearly meaningful that you can make so much progress throughout the game but still just decide to throw it all away. It gives the impression that whatever Muma is going through, it's something that won't just go away with a bit of thought or a few good moments. And in a way, that does well to give the player motivation. My first thought after dying in the game was that perhaps if I do something, if I do enough, Muma can be saved. That's not to say narrative motivation is strictly necessary, as Yume Nikki itself merely drops the player into the setting and expects them to be pushed forward only by their own desire, but it certainly doesn't hurt. And I think Muma Rope is making an attempt to give the player a goal, as evidenced by the starting room showing 2 types of collectibles and making them literally unavoidable. I say collectible in a very literal manner, because unlike every other Yume Nikki fan game I've played, Muma Rope doesn't really have effects. There's no pause menu in the game at all. Most of them exist only for the purpose of being collected. Now, some of these items can be used in the levels they're found in, the clearest example being the sword in Unicorn Woods, but they can't be taken outside of their designated areas, and there's only a handful of memories that actually do anything. A lot of the time, these items are more like the signifiers that you've finished the challenge of the level. To an extent, I can understand the restrictive application of abilities. Maybe it was done to give a greater sense of individual level distinction, or perhaps the unique quirks of some levels were deemed far too extreme to simply apply to the rest of the game. But I don't think the level-dependent ability system is necessarily incompatible with, or superior to, the traditional system of effects you can use anywhere. For one thing, the lack of anything to increase player speed leaves the game feeling a bit slow. To be fair, Muma's default speed is reasonable, and most maps are light on open space, which makes going around bends or between points of interest not take too long. But when you have to go through the same few starting areas, you can't help but feel the urge to move through it faster, which the game will rarely allow. The infamously derided Dream Diary had a similar problem, compounded by its more linear levels, but the game still had effects. and a quite convenient system for using them. While moving from the set points of importance, I took joy from jumping around or using the kitchen knife dash attack as a method to break up the monotony of mere movement. Muma's walk animation is more visually interesting than most things in Dream Diary, but it's hardly enough to last a whole playthrough without getting a bit bored. And while there is decent context-dependent sprite variety, the inability to wear a different outfit, change the weather, or to move or stop or kill any NPC makes the game feel a bit lacking. It could still be said that there are some concessions made for the sake of speed in lieu of any effect, most notably a door in the first level that allows you to skip a cutscene transition to the level below. And putting aside that this door could be close to the middle of the map, I just think this shows that there should have been more to fix the issue of return trips. There are a few terms I should quickly define to speak on how the game's levels are organized. Depth is the measure of how far a level is from the starting position, measured by the locations you have to go through to get there. Breadth is the number of other levels that one level connects to. A series of levels could be described as a branch. For example, the route from the Snow World to Boa's Trap is a branch extending from the Nexus that goes a few levels deep. Interconnectivity is an emergent property of levels having both depth and breadth leading to other branches, which means that even if you go far down one particular path, you don't have to start over or go backwards in order to continue exploring another. Mumarope's Dream World has depth and, to my eyes, decent interconnectivity, but it starts to feel a bit lacking in terms of initial breadth. You always have to exit the starting room to the first level, and from the first level there's only a handful of levels to go from. Those levels all have a handful more, and from that point the breadth, depth, and interconnectivity all expand greatly. However, your initial journeys to any given point will always start out in a similar handful of ways. Part of what I consider genius in the design of Yume Nikki is the initial breadth, that you have a lot of options from the Nexus. That you always have to go through Madotsuki's room in the Nexus to have all these options never struck me as inconvenient because those two levels are the most important by their functions and other mechanics. There's not a lot of interconnectivity in Yume Nikki's Dream World. In fact, I'd say it's largely defined by levels in standalone sequence with the occasional one-way door, but you didn't often end up needing to go through the same levels to see or do something because of that initial breadth. I'm not saying that's necessarily a perfect system, because the interconnectivity of Dream Worlds I've seen in most Yume Nikki fan games is not only something I enjoy, but it's clearly something quite popular among creators and fans. However, the same principles of design that make interconnectivity fun, the application of breadth in a way that makes for unique paths to the Dream World, mean that you should also value the starting levels having high initial breadth. Which is why I find it quite odd that so many fan games, regardless of their later depth and interconnectivity, start off having a much lower initial breadth. On the more positive side, I do quite appreciate Mumarope's iteration upon general control. Without effects, the game basically only needs directional input, an interact button, and a return button. It's really close to being a game you could comfortably play with one hand, but for some reason the only directional input buttons it doesn't accept are WASD. Though I guess if you consider HJKL comfortable, then you're good. Returning to the start actually requires you to hold the button, and I honestly appreciate the half-second delay. Better to spend a few seconds of an overall playthrough on waiting than risk the potential minutes of time on a return trip if you end up pressing the button on accident. Because the game lacks effects, it mostly does away with menuing UI, the most notable exception being the progress bar in the return animation to indicate when it starts. It's probably not a big deal, especially considering the menu sins committed by every other Yume Nikki fan game in the original itself, but it feels almost like an aberration to how the rest of Mumarope operates. If progress was instead communicated with an indicator that was at least plausibly diegetic, then we could say the game achieves perfect simplicity and control. However, an assessment of Mumarope only considered with its general iteration on structure and mechanics is one that absolutely sells the game short. Even in the realm of Yume Nikki and its derivatives, Mumarope fills the player with the belief that anything could happen. One of the very first areas is the retro dungeon, which not only presents a completely different visual style applied to even the sprites of Muma and the commonly recurring bunny NPC, it also features an overworld health system when running into an enemy or obstacle that can be restored at certain points. Quite simple in a vacuum, but attached to this area is the inverted retro dungeon, where everything has the opposite relationship, running into a trap where an enemy will have Muma destroy them, and touching the cross will instead drain all her health. And this is only the surface level of what you can expect from the game. The puzzle chamber required coding in around half a dozen unique objects and drawing about 3 dozen unique tiles to make complicated puzzle mechanics which are only put to use for a short tutorial in one big room that simultaneously contains 3 different puzzles. This is a good enough groundwork for a whole game of its own, and while you might spend a decent amount of time on this puzzle, in terms of the overall game, it's just a single area with only 1 coin and a memory, and it honestly makes for one of the most fun moments in any Yume Nikki fan games I've ever played. Aside from being inherently enjoyable, I feel like the high effort put into a random set piece that's basically discarded after you're done manages to not break the carefully constructed tone conveyed by the rest of the game lacking any identifiable features of genre. Calling Mumarope a puzzle game would be like calling Yume Nikki an arcade game just because it has Nasu. And there's more than mechanical variety to serve as a draw. Many areas feature a unique set of sprites from Muma to either fit better with the theming or the art art style. It might be a bit subtle in some spots, but it's undeniably stylish nonetheless. And that's not to mention all the bespoke animations that Muma has for the sake of interaction with specific objects, but I worried I'd just be going over a list of every highlight in the game if I gave too much detail. So instead I'll leave what I've already said as a representative sample and say that the more mechanically centered levels represent a significant chunk, though not a plurality, of the different area types. I notice a lot of levels are contained in tight spaces, corridors or rooms with connecting halls, and sometimes a more traditional maze or teleport maze or dungeon. So many levels actually create some significant patch of untraversable land that even when a level has a more open section, I would argue it's not defined by the negative space the same way the chiefly barren fields of Yume Nikki were. Not that this is necessarily a bad thing. Muma is capturing a feeling of aimlessness in different proportions than Yume Nikki, and it much more frequently tries to establish a sense of place and position in its individual maps. Whether that be, this is the forest part of the microworld, or this is the projector room. But for any worry about the game preventing you from getting lost there may be, Muma has one of the top 3 wildest and most difficult mazes in any Yume Nikki inspired game I've yet encountered. It's very big and complicated, colorful and confusing, and it requires moving through doors that teleport you around, and it's very diagonal. But overall, I did enjoy the world selection of Muma. If there's one point of criticism I have on a very specific element though, it's that I felt the endings were a bit lackluster. Skip to the next section if it matters to you, but well, you're not missing much. The normal ending for collecting every memory has Muma slump over on the chair as the room fades away. Cutouts of each location and memory float by, coded to display in the order the player discovered them. This also serves as a detailed credit sequence, indicating the artist and composer who contributed to each level. If you get every empty, then you'll see a similar ending, where Muma pushes away the chair and walks into darkness, breaking the world as if to escape the bounds of the room completely. A white flash envelops the screen and the credits play, now with just names floating around the screen. The reason why I was a bit overwhelmed here is because, as I said before, Muma fills the player with a belief that anything could happen. That the game starts with the main protagonist taking her own life left me with no idea what the ending could entail, other than perhaps a happier outcome where she survives. Of course, the game does deliver on that, but that's all it does. Part of my hopes involved there being some sort of surprise, further complicating details, or maybe a greater elaboration. Instead, the ending is just the most obvious answer done plainly. Survival is our most base instinct. Therefore, someone going against their biologically encoded impulses can be at least assumed to have elaborate motivation. Regardless of your interpretation regarding the meaning of Yume Nikki, it's hard to say that the ending doesn't do much. I already mentioned the common reframing of Adotsuki's character, which can mean various things depending on what you consider the intention of the game and Adotsuki within it, and you could also say it's a grand denial of finality, a declaration that the player should value the experience of exploration and observation itself. However you shake it, I'd say this ending is iconic precisely because it feels revelatory and significant. Considering you could say the same about various other Yume Nikki fan games, I think it's not too lofty a standard to expect from Muma up here. The best excuse I could make for the normal endings is that perhaps they're meant to feel just a bit disappointing. There is, after all, an entire secret ending, which feels like a very clear escalation. Perhaps it could be said that you're meant to feel motivated to unlock this path, not that this makes for the best defense, but we'll give the game a bit of leniency. After all, the secret ending requires a fairly lengthy and bizarre path, impressing a sense of significance onto the player. Among the obscure conditions for unlocking it include only picking up the bloody knife, avoiding all their items, including the two you literally can't. This means you'll have to make a whole new save file, and probably use a guide. Most of the route to the secret ending just revolves around going to somewhat hidden areas of the game to find various NPCs identical to Muma, some of which you may have encountered during a normal playthrough, and then letting the conditions trigger to let you watch a cutscene of one Muma killing the other. There are various events that trigger along this path, but after you've done about 4 of these, the goal is to return to the beginning. However, you can no longer return to the room with the push of a button, and the door in the first area is no longer there, so you'll have to find one of the random doors scattered about. I always wondered why they existed other than to troll the curious player by reciting their progress, but it turns into a simple but still cute little navigation puzzle. Returning to the room and going up reveals the door to a completely new area. Continuing up further will lead to Muma taking damage with no way to heal, until she's taken more than the length of her health bar. The only interactable object is a computer, and upon interaction the player will lose control of Muma and instead gain control of a cursor, which can select X to make Muma disappear. Aside from messing around, the only action from this point is to select the fake X at the top right, which makes the game say Muma is over. If I can be honest, I have mixed feelings on this ending too. The use of the UI to depict damage that Muma still moves on through feels meaningful, as if her determination towards her goal is giving her a superhuman pain tolerance. But what she's doing throughout the route is destroying herself, something which she could have done at the very beginning or at any time before the end. What makes this particular method so important? I feel like the only way I can interpret this ending as uniquely meaningful is to read it in a metatextual lens. Muma is erasing herself, not to escape from her life in the world, but to escape her existence as an entity within the game's space. You could say this reflects the fact that the secret ending would only ever be naturally found by the player who goes through a process of repeated and elaborate experimentation. We will ignore the fact that you, the player, control Muma as she goes through this route, or that this ending, like like every other just sends you the title screen for you to do it all over again, assuming that to be a matter of limitation. Despite this feeling like the only coherent interpretation of meaning that I could think of, I'm not sure I really like it. For one thing, it's hard to agree with even the premise of a game delivering a bizarre condemnation to the act of playing it, but I can't even praise the execution on that point. I find it very likely that this ending of Muma is at least partially inspired by One Shot and Undertale, and while they're both very different works with arguably opposite approaches to the style, I think they hold up much better. While One Shot is focused on the dynamic between the diegetic player and the main character, this is chiefly a tool used to provide further characterization and to develop a metaphor regarding Nico's relationship to the world. It's hard to say either is true of Muma, as this distinction isn't clarified until the final moments, and we already know from the beginning that she wanted to die. On the other side of the aisle, Undertale isn't a game where the main point is to finger wag the player for the act of breaking a fictional social contract. It is a pointed critique of genre and of meaning that is conveyed by the act of play. Whether or not you agree with the skepticism towards unquestioned conquering ubiquitous in the medium that Undertale explores, at the very least it is effective in conveying its perspective on art. Even among those uncompelled by its commentary, I'm sure it's rare to find someone who wasn't moved by the game's promotion of non-violence and of extending empathy towards everyone. Again, the last-minute nature of the Muma secret ending gives it little time to explore the subject in depth, or with much emotional resonance, or with any clarity. In fact, it feels almost impossible to put into words what, if anything, this ending is meant to critique. Considering how often the game portrays things which are only banal due to the fact that they are fictional, I'd say it undercuts the player's capacity to regard the work as some sort of morality play with literalist or metatextual implications. And when I put it like that, it honestly doesn't make any sense to me. I can't tell what frame of mind I'm really meant to have in order to appreciate the game holistically. I will admit there may be some grand allegory I'm completely missing. I'm no genius, nor am I in any position of authority on ambiguous and abstract art. But until I reach this theoretical greater understanding, the secret route just appears to be shallow justification to partake in set pieces that admittedly are all pretty cool, but it doesn't really alleviate my disappointment with how the game closed out. I do have to disclose that I may be a bit biased here. Although I'd like to understand this game and to have come away praising the whole experience, from the beginning I assumed I may come across contradictions or potentially superfluous elements purely on the basis of it being a collaborative project. Having no real knowledge of the development process, I wondered if the various contributors all had different conceptions of Muma as a character, and that any lack of consistency would be covered up through the technical ambiguity of the setting and story. I'm still ignorant, so for all I know there could have been extreme coordination between everyone to ensure a coherent vision of Muma was realized as a process. I doubt it, but hey. If not, then this would explain the utter lack of elaboration in the normal ending as the incomprehensibility of the secret route. Muma has to remain an amorphous character, and so this is the explanation that I lean toward. While I could perhaps excuse the lack of concrete direction in a fan game like Yume Nikki, where I'd say the premise and appeal lies in the whispers of individual humanity contributing to a collective exclamation of love for Yume Nikki, it feels harder to extend such courtesy to Muma. As I said in the beginning, the game titles itself and opens upon a grand and provocative assurance of meaning. But still, I liked Muma, so I'd much prefer to criticize the short endings and some minor details than to undermine the long journey in the premise itself. It was emotionally effective at times, and genuinely fun without needing to coalesce into a coherent narrative. Which is to say, Muma did as well as a fan game in evoking similar feelings to Yume Nikki. Which is not to say that coherent narrative is a bad thing, though. In fact, one of the most popular Yume Nikki fan games is acclaimed chiefly for that reason. Austin Jorgensen's Lisa, later redubbed Lisa the First, for reasons we won't speak about in this video, actually has what I might call an opening of similar nature to Muma, being straightforward in conveyance of the dark subject matter concerning the titular protagonist. The two concepts that immediately leap to mind are control and disgust. The latter comes from the stains and filth littering the rooms, the mild disrepair of the house, and that half the interactable objects in the home are garbage cans or dirty sheets. The former comes from a sense of restriction, the mostly barren rooms with everything locked, the literal text saying he's taken away everything. These concepts are given a source in just the next room by the big, balding, sloppish, television-watching man who exerts restriction even on the player by restricting their progress should you walk within his line of sight. With just this, the game establishes one of its two major pillars, the character of Marty, the father. After leaving through the front door, the player is greeted with a few scenes of beautiful nature, which is then interrupted by a distorted background of Marty's face, a barely visible path littered with trash and the grating sounds of the television show he was watching inside. At the end of it, another Marty appears to tell Lisa that she can't run forever. Though perhaps less obvious at the moment, at this point the game has established the mental state of its other major pillar, Lisa herself. And then the game puts the player in what will serve as its main hub. This is when the game reveals just how heavily it takes from Yume Nikki, with various areas that derive a sense of arrangement and design from that game. I do notice from the videos I've seen discussing Lisa that the designation of the work as a Yume Nikki fan game is given with a bit of uncertainty. It feels a little bit absurd to act as if it's questionable or controversial. The game is clearly and admittedly inspired by Yume Nikki. It shares the premise of roaming around the dream world of the protagonist. It uses RPG Maker for a game without RPG mechanics. And the design similarities are so uncanny that some some of these could reasonably pass as normal in any other Yume Nikki fan game, or even Yume Nikki itself. We might say that Lisa the First being a part of the grander Lisa franchise removes her from the standing of a fan game, but it seems odd that a continuation can retroactively change the nature of a work in that way. I guess in a sense the game has gone from a fan game to its own intellectual property, but I would consider the designation closer to a genre descriptor. The genre now widely called boomer shooters used to be known as Doom clones, and perhaps if the label of Yume Nikki fan games underwent a similar fate, there would be no qualms regarding its application to Lisa. Which isn't to say that Lisa is all too identical to Yume Nikki. It is quite linear, and there are a handful of fairly straightforward puzzle sections, but the same could be said about Yume Nikki Dream Diary, a game which is honestly surprisingly similar in construction to Lisa the First. It's actually kind of weird, but also undeniably derivative of the original Yume Nikki. But I think this comparison highlights the reason why the label is controversial for Lisa. This game is best enjoyed when it is understood on its own terms, rather than as a Yume Nikki derivative. With a lot of Yume Nikki fan games, I often find myself thinking, if this game came out before or even contemporary to the original Yume Nikki, how would the perceived dynamics of the two works shift? And with works including .flow, Yume Tuki, or even Muma, I think those games would have been just as revolutionary. Perhaps in this alternate timeline, whatever Kikiyama would end up making would have been seen as a respectable and competently made derivative, but probably not as the unimpeachable peak. I don't think that Lisa would have the same effect, though, because it's a generally more conventional work than Yume Nikki. The start of the game gives a concrete narrative hook, the significant segments of the story are conveyed through text, and most importantly, the level design of the game doesn't quite capture the aimless and dreamlike feeling of other Dream games. On a scale between LSD Dream Emulator and Silent Hill, Lisa fits in the middle, whereas Yume Nikki is a lot closer to LSD. But the assessment of the game as merely Yume Nikki but not as cool and weird is frankly foolish. It's not really trying to be Yume Nikki, it's trying to be its own thing, and it's using some of the language of Yume Nikki to do so, just as the game's visual style takes their inspiration from Earthbound as a sort of translation of that game's contrast between simplicity and cuteness eventually coming up against something more mature and horrifying. But, you know, we wouldn't say this is terrible, there aren't even any fights, or something like that. I think it can be understood that Lisa is using the Dream game format to give a certain style and tone to the narrative it's trying to convey, and I would say that it absolutely shines in regard to the visual and semi-interactive storytelling. Unsurprisingly, child abuse is a very complex topic. Abuse from a parent is one of the most damaging things that can happen to a child because parents are supposed to be the one source of love you can absolutely rely on. Even if you have no friends, even if you feel alienated by your peers, you can derive a sense of value from the people who take care of you. We can see this assumption of love when the game depicts Marty as having at one point seemed quite nice, however reliably we want to interpret that. But the attachment of positive feelings onto an abuser isn't necessarily unique to parents. A turbo parent isn't just the addition of hardship, it is the absence of reprieve. The dream world in this game never really conveys safety or comfort because Lisa herself doesn't feel any of that. Even what could be a source of light and friendship or hobby is stamped out by Marty, keeping her isolated in an empty room. Lacking in activity or socialization is also harmful, but it goes even further if the child ponders the parent's motivation. Some parents would defend their child from anything, so what does it say when a parent would hurt their child? Compounding from the assumed kindness and love a parent will be associated with, the child may conclude that they are the problem, even if they haven't done anything wrong. They may believe the fundamental nature of their being is so indefensible that the parent's reaction is natural, justified. Without the opportunity to develop a sense of self-worth, the child suffers not only from external circumstances, but in their internal world as well. All this is essentially what Lisa is constantly conveying. That Marty is represented as a straightforward symbol for control and disgust is only half the formula. What really establishes the absence of love, the lack of reprieve, the inability of Lisa to develop a sense of self is the omnipresence of Marty within the dream world. That the game is comparatively unambiguous and blunt is only a boon for it. Every moment really conveys the feeling that it's going for, which is to say, it probably wouldn't have been quite so striking or nearly as good if it was only trying to be like Yume Nikki. Of course, this sort of judgment is easy to make for a game that so obviously moves away from the conventions of Yume Nikki, but some people might not consider when they're applying an unfair standard on a work if it bears more structural similarity. For example, one could say Answered Prayers appears to be a fairly conventional Yume Nikki derivative with a straightforward Shinto motif. After the short walk-around section directing the player to the shrine with only a save point and enters the dream world, they'll find a small nexus in a collection of worlds totaling a little less than half the number featured in the original Yume Nikki. But to simplify the work to just what it has less of, or in common with Yume Nikki, is to lose what makes it interesting. The premise of Answered Prayers is honestly one of its biggest mysteries. While most Yume Nikki fan games operate on the assumption of a dream world in the mind of protagonist, which doesn't really need explanation, here we see the soul of Florette literally leave her body. The first assumption, maybe this is a general spirit world of some sort, seeing as it is filled with religious imagery and the dead. However, I question if this realm is as general as it first appears. If you collect every effect in this game, here labeled as prayers, then a spirit will appear in the hub level demanding that you leave. This may imply that the spirit can claim some particular ownership of this world. Maybe this is a particular god or a representation of various deities, or maybe it's a particularly powerful individual spirit this realm formed around. It may not necessarily be the spirit world, but a world belonging to a spirit. This may seem like a distinction without a difference, but the framing has a profoundly different effect on how we might interpret the contents. It feels like an obvious criticism that the framing device of religious imagery is undercut by frequent references to the Game Boy, and that, with the context of Yume Nikki, you can't help but imagine one of the primary motivations to reference retro video gaming was the fact that Yume Nikki had sections based on Mother for the Famicom. But if we go with the individual spirit explanation, then the answer for why the Game Boy sections exist can be part of the same logic for why the Famicom sections exist in the mind of Midotsky. The same could be true if we say the spirit world is shaped by many spirits. But even a particularly godly bend isn't so far-fetched. If the realm of God is filled with references to video games, then that must mean that something about the medium of video gaming is close to the divine. And if you've enjoyed the beauty of Yume Nikki, I'm sure you can at least understand why someone else would think that way. Pretentious? Maybe, but not unwarranted. I think the what if this fan game came before Yume Nikki hypothetical is an interesting one here, because perhaps with a reference point or what may be a literal reference, people would be more willing to interpret parts of the game through a lens of harmonious intentionality. I'd also say the game belongs among the ranks of those that would be considered revolutionary. Of course, even putting aside the visionary design of Yume Nikki, Kikiyama was extremely technically proficient in their craft. Coding issues aside, Yume Nikki has beautiful animated imagery, an amazing soundtrack, and tons of mechanical detail. This kind of thing is hard to simply mimic, which is why you probably don't hear a lot about most Yume Nikki fan games, despite there being a lot of them. Answered Prayers, despite being extremely short, manages to display perhaps an even greater proficiency in its form. In fact, maybe it's precisely because it's such a short game that I can confidently say almost every level is great enough that, were it in the original Yume Nikki or a high-profile fan game, it probably would be widely considered a fan favorite. It's hard to criticize the effectively mechanical feeling of the Clockwork world, with not only the gears but even the characters moving in turn, or the adjacent level Gradient world with its simple beauty and similarly evocative NPC movement. Even in a level where the player is alone, such as the adjacent level Broken Clock Park, the game is able to set such an incredible tone with not just the environmental detail of the titular clocks and the random passageways, but in the singular axis of movement the player is allowed. And as mentioned, these levels are adjacent to one another, forming a fantastic contrast to the journey. Answered Prayers makes great use of this throughout, serving to highlight the individuality of each level. Even the Symbol Maze, which is one of the top 2 wildest and most difficult mazes in any Yume Nikki-inspired game I've yet encountered, is incredibly memorable for its primary gimmick, as much as it hurts my eyeballs. The Game Boy-style portraits in the menu for every effect make for such a charming addition that my oft-repeated statement of the menuing is the least interesting part of a Yume Nikki fan game no longer applies here. The elephant in the room may be that the game is so short primarily because it's not exactly finished. Nothing really happens after you get all the effects, and it's clear that a second act was due to be implemented. The game hasn't received any updates in over a decade, though 3 years ago the website was updated to imply there would eventually be more to come. As of this video's release, that hasn't happened, so, you know. The developer is still active online, though, and if you're dying to see more of her beautiful art, then you have plenty of that to find outside of Answered Prayers. Among that includes the comic Homunculus, which is apparently set in the same world as Answered Prayers. I've deliberately avoided reading it before finishing this part of the video, so I'll leave it to myself in the editing room to give a verdict on that. Regardless, the output of Cloudfear, still going strong over a decade later, struck me with the thought that this is someone whose genuine life passion is to create beautiful art. I understand why she'd be drawn to Yume Nikki, not just on the grounds of its own craftsmanship and appeal, but in the fact that a Yume Nikki fan game provides an amazing outlet for artistic expression. I do wonder what the intended narrative of Answered Prayers may be, though I think the game sort of captures the appeal of speculating on Yume Nikki and the fact that there is an answer, but because the work is incomplete, it's impossible for anyone else to truly know. Even if we didn't have the assurance of the author on the matter, the game has no shortage of recurring symbolism that indicates there to be some logic to the setting. It leaves the player with a feeling that something is there, but it's just out of reach. Maybe the loss of this feeling in a hypothetical completed version will be alienating for some people, but I can only imagine that with the talent to create what's in the game so far, the answer will be even better than the question. But hey, a lot of Yume Nikki fan games end up unfinished or abandoned simply because it takes a lot of time and effort to produce a game like Yume Nikki. In fact, we have a very obvious modern example of this to look at. Yume Nikki PS1, produced by Elias Dollar, is a 3D recreation of Yume Nikki made to run on real PlayStation hardware, or an emulator, making it the only thing preventing me from titling this video RPG Maker Mini Reviews Episode 2, thankfully. I don't have a CRT monitor, and the only legitimate method I have to play this game would be on my PlayStation 3, so instead I'll speak on the emulator experience. I have a lot to say about the graphics here, because when it comes to this sort of thing, it isn't just a matter of turning every setting up as high as possible before you get frame dips. I played and recorded Silent Hill and Metal Gear Solid earlier this year before I'd properly figured out any of the settings, and as you can observe, this made my footage look a bit shit. Without proper filtering and rendering, all the tricks that these old games put forth to look at least like a blurry, distorted image of reality are wasted. The artifice laid bare so harshly that the end result looks almost like toys. To be fair, in the case of Yume Nikki, realism isn't really an end goal. You could say, with the art direction of the game making Madotsuki appear as a deformed, abstracted depiction of a human, there's already a toy-like quality to it. I would instead argue that this is a matter of fitting in well with the bizarre and abstract imagery of the rest of the work. While I don't think this fan game looks bad with true color and high resolution, I think the visual style is aided in the same way as a more realistic game, if at least for the sake of approaching authenticity. I think the setting that best serves the visual style is unscaled dithering, with shader blending to avoid visual glitches. Almost all of the developer screenshots have visible dithering, not only because I believe most of them are captured on real hardware, which means the look confers authenticity, but also probably because it just looks good. I will admit there is merit to the argument that the surreal world of Yume Nikki may benefit from the warbling geometry. However, the effect of this is most pronounced in Madotsuki's bedroom. That's probably the one area where you can say it's not meant to look like that, so turn that off. A lot of settings will conspire to make the 2D sprite work look a bit off. Certain crop settings will make the pause menu larger than the screen, and various combinations of texture filtering and downsampling will make 2D blurry. I'm sure a significant percentage of people played Yume Nikki through the default RPG Maker 2003 window, so their memory of the game and its original sprite work is as something a little bit blurry, but having played the game through Easy RPG and a bit on YNO Project, I much prefer at least the text, the menus, and the sprites ripped directly from the original game to be crisp. Another setting that messes with the menu is widescreen rendering with any aspect ratio that isn't 4:3, which will stretch out the sprite work. The wider view does serve a purpose in giving a fuller view of the gameplay, but this fan game and the original it's based on were both designed with a 4:3 aspect ratio in mind. And personally, I can't support the type of person who will turn their nose up at a 4:3 aspect ratio. I messed around with resolution most of all because it was difficult to decide on what I thought made the game look its best. On one hand, there's greater clarity with higher resolution. I love making use of my beautiful 2K monitor. On the other hand, lower resolutions have a grit and ambiguity that may better suit a game like this, and it won't clash against the dithering on certain settings. I think perhaps the most important thing to consider is that Madotsuki's head should appear to be round, and the jagged model is clearly pointy when the resolution is too high. Now that I've talked about the graphics settings, I'm going to actually speak on the art direction. I'm typically not one to draw comparisons of works that I consider too unrelated from one another, especially when taking a negative tone, as I think it can often be too inflammatory to serve whatever persuasive purpose I might have wanted. But I find it hard to play this game without, in my mind, thinking back to the infamous Yume Nikki Dream Diary. Now, if you watch my video on this game, you should understand that I don't believe Dream Diary was trying to be a remake or a 3D recreation of the original Yume Nikki. I believe the intent of that game was not to replace the original, but to reconstitute meaning and imagery in order to be its own experience, to deliver commentary which wouldn't make sense without the context of the original. So I think any comparison that speaks on a direct translation of this source material is sort of pointless, because YNPS is trying to do something completely different from Dream Diary in that regard. But I also think there's more than one way to be faithful to the core of the original Yume Nikki. For example, Yume Nikki played with the fidelity of small sprite work to its advantage, allowing the simplified and abstracted design of elements with a real-life equivalent to avoid clashing with the bizarre and surreal imagery of everything else. For many things, it's almost difficult to tell if it's intended to be some imaginary being or a depiction of something from reality. Dream Diary instead went in pursuit of realism, which can be seen in Madotsuki having detailed textures and more human proportions. Aside from the fact that this art style was not at all similar to Yume Nikki, in order to create consistency of form, everything else had to be portrayed in higher detail to fit together, which removed ambiguity and abstraction from designs. I would argue they went in a pretty boring direction because there's hardly a character where upon seeing their texture detail proportions I didn't think, I never thought of the original sprite like that. It all seemed quite conventional and obvious. I did enjoy some area interpretations, but that often had to do with rearrangement or a change in lighting or scale, and less to do with the shitty attempts at realistic graphics. This also had the effect of making everything that didn't match the attempted realism stand out more, which included most of the very simple animations applied to Madotsuki. Also, everything looks ugly as hell. YNPS manages to maintain the spirit of the original Yume Nikki in a 3D environment because it also plays with that low fidelity, with simplified and abstracted designs. The proportions of characters and the level of detail on models and environments very closely resemble their two-dimensional counterparts, a product of very intentional effort from Dollar. I think most people would agree with me when I say it feels like a perfect 3D adaptation of Yume Nikki's 2D art, which is good for a fan game where the intent was to be a 3D recreation. Now, as of this video's production, YNPS is only a short demo containing 2 of the many worlds in Yume Nikki. Considering that just this took a month and a half, it would take literal years to complete the full recreation, if Dollar chooses to continue on that long, and assuming Kikiyama doesn't add anything more to the original. Though, to be optimistic, a large part of that came in the process of figuring out the fundamentals and adding everything to some of the most interactive and highly detailed portions of the original game, that being the Nexus in Madotsuki's room. Interactions with the television alone probably took up a fourth of the demo's dev time, and it's honestly well off for it. My initial reaction to the diegetic first perspective of Nasu imposed onto the model of the television screen was to remember Capcom Arcade Stadium, where the default settings put the fake machine as a border around the game, which I turned off because I thought it would be distracting footage. However, I'd forgotten that the original Nasu is actually contained within a much smaller window. Not only was this decision a lot more intuitive and fitting than I'd initially assumed, it was definitely superior to either an properly scaled recreation or just a black void as the background. This version of Nasu isn't perfectly accurate, aside from some values of speed, size, and timing that feel different but are perhaps harder to explain or prove. In the fan game, you see the eggplant for a moment before they start falling down. But honestly, I feel the additional leniency makes the game more fun. It's also probably better to play a game like this not on a keyboard, but on a controller, as Minotsky is depicted doing in-game. Speaking of the controller, a lot of what differentiates this fan game from the original comes from the added functionality given to the various buttons on the controller. This version is much more ergonomic than the keyboard controls of Yume Nikki, with clever placement of the menu and wake-up buttons on start and select, as they're likely to be pressed rarely and only when nothing else is being done. You have the option to run from the beginning, which I presume will obsolete the not implemented as of yet bike effect. But honestly, that might be for the best, as most people use a bike effect all the time. Now they might try out something else if they can just go fast all the time with it. There's also a jump button. Funny thing, I said in my June Diary video that platforming could work if it came across as chiefly incidental rather than the product of level design aimed at a platforming experience, and in a way, just adding a jump button to the original Yume Nikki does accomplish that. So far in the game, the introduction of a third movement axis does nothing of value besides letting you stand in some new places, which feels in line with the traversal of the original. But there is a new sense of value to just standing somewhere with the 3D environment and camera controls. In fact, this demo has a whole photo mode, where you can basically move in free cam to take a photo however you want. It's sort of hard to linger on this feature in written format, but I think this is one of the best parts of the demo. One of the chief appeals of Yume Nikki is the act of observing the surreal imagery, and one of the benefits of adapting that to 3D is the freedom to look at that imagery from any angle. I wouldn't be surprised if I kept seeing screenshots of this fan game 10 years from now, even if it doesn't get any more updates. Despite having the freedom of a controller, the game doesn't do much to cut down on the menuing of the original, which is perfectly intact in this version. I couldn't help but think that maybe a quick menu using the right joystick could help with that, though I understand this fan game is, to a significant extent, aimed at people who will play using a controller that doesn't have a right joystick. But since it's a technically redundant function where the alternative simply mirrors the original, it probably wouldn't be too disruptive. Personally, I think the menuing of Yume Nikki is the least interesting part, so anything which seeks to minimize it is a goal worth striving towards, in my opinion. With the fundamentals put in place, there are a few questions on how the change in format will affect some particularly gimmicky areas. The Famicom world will probably be conceptually difficult to adapt. It's not exactly easy to replicate a 3D style even earlier than the PlayStation and on the PlayStation itself as well. The tight corridors of the Hell Maze might also be awkward to represent when you can jump on things, though perhaps a fixed camera might help, and representing perhaps the single most iconic moment in the original game might end up a bit more demanding with a 3D environment. I wouldn't be surprised if the necessary choices of adaptation turn into splitting points for fans of the original regardless of what path is taken. That's assuming that any of these will end up in whatever becomes the final product. The FAQ section of this game's download page has $ indicate a greater desire to produce something original than to spend years remaking all of Yume Nikki. And to be honest, I completely understand. The inevitable fate of Yume Nikki PS1 will be people comparing it to the original Yume Nikki. Rarely can a work be, by its very nature, so overshadowed. Even a sequel or a remake can be given the grace of evaluation on its own terms. Hell, sometimes the sequel gets more popular. But to produce a derivative work, especially completely for free, can feel like a thankless task in comparison. There was a point when making this video that I sort of wondered why such talented people put such effort into these fan games. Aside from the fact that none of these games I've spoken about are being sold for money, Yume Nikki isn't hugely popular in the first place, and the plethora of fan works make any individual one less likely to stand out. There clearly is a strong motivating factor here, and it's not along the lines of tangible incentive. I know my perspective on art isn't the most common, but I feel the only purpose for ignoring the author and process behind a work, besides any arbitrary principle, would be to support some particular interpretation or characterization of it that would otherwise be untenable. But in my opinion, art is a form of communication, and in the act of communication, intent does matter. This is not to say that execution or input from the subconscious is irrelevant, but without at least attempting to understand intention, you can't really understand anything. And I feel that in every piece of Yume Nikki fan content, whether it be the games or art or anything else, there is a clear and obvious intent, a message being expressed. It is love for Yume Nikki, and it's almost hard to think of something more beautiful than art made for the love of art itself.